Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Good morning. I greet you with the thought of being a good morning. But what makes it good or not good? Our minds actually decide whether the events that are happening are good or not good for us. We're headed toward the darkest time of the year, and I'm talking about the length of the daylight. The winter solstice is about a week away, and it will get darker before it gets lighter. We are now in a pandemic that is getting worse. America is leading the world in cases of COVID and in deaths. Proportionally, I think we're about 2 to 5 times worse than most other modern industrialized nations. As a former dentist, it is frustrating to see that this pandemic has been politicized by our national leader. Whether their health condition is determined by a political party. Now, what proof is there that tooth decay, heart disease, cancer affects one party more than another? And yet ignorance has led a health concern to be distracted and led many to think that it's a political issue. As a minister, I feel a responsibility to inform others of the true nature of our condition. The disease needs to be addressed by doctors and other health professionals, not politicians. I'm wondering if you would trust me as a dentist to do heart surgery on you, or would you trust a TV celebrity to decide Americans' health policy instead of health professionals who have worked hard for many decades in these fields? And I'm saying this because it is upsetting to see so many Americans get sick and die when things could be different. It's upsetting that we cannot go to jobs, school, shop, eat, or go to entertainment venues. It's upsetting that we can't gather together at the temple for services and funerals and other significant activities. We can't gather for these activities because of the threat of the virus. If we had acted as one national action in perhaps May, June, or July, our businesses and schools might be open. But because of gatherings on Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, and recently, as much as Thanksgiving, now almost 300,000 Americans have died. And it's because of ignorance, no patience, misleading information. So many people are suffering, and I have to urge everyone to follow some of the Buddhist teachings in having patience, but also to stay socially distanced, wear a mask to prevent the spread, and follow the health guidelines. In these times of suffering, Buddhism can be a guide to overcome the negative. When Siddhartha Gautama was sitting and practicing for 6 years without any results, it was a very dark time. He finally accepted rice gruel from a maiden, Sudatra, and he gave up this ascetic work that didn't work for him. When Honin's group was disbanded, Shinran was exiled to Echigo. It was a very dark time for him. He had been a monk, and this new group that he had joined had been disbanded. Both Shinran and Siddhartha gave up traditional practice, which wasn't working for them, and the future looked bleak. Things would get worse before it got better. But each determined to realize truth, to liberate themselves from the ignorance that contained them. And we are now so fortunate to have the guidance of both Shinran and the Buddha to help us through this similar time of darkness. Let's turn to the Buddha channel we talked about a few weeks ago. The first step I suggested was what? To do nothing. Sit and breathe. Remember that the Gassho posture allows us to realize that all we need to recall is that we breathe in, breathe out, and that we're alive, and to appreciate that. And the posture of this Gassho and reciting the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, has this thought of appreciation. And it's important that what we do before we take action is to be settled and centered. And with this attitude, we can now think of how we can move forward, because we realize that the efforts of others have helped us come to this point, and now we might think of what we might do to help others. So even with these difficulties of the darkness that lays ahead, we might see a path of light. Siddhartha realized that during the night before his enlightenment, we hear that Mara's army attacked him and his daughters tried to entice him. But he realized that these were only thoughts of his own mind. And so he was able to shift and finally awake to his enlightenment. He woke to the truth that really surrounded him. His channel was focused on the light and life. Shinran was exiled in the distant land of Echigo, and he had given up his life as a monk. And so his future looked very bleak. And so as a common person, he married, first monk to do that. But he continued to study, teach, and write. And his writing brought light into his life. Living with the peasants, he saw how many other people lived in life. And so his teaching reflected this. And his teaching was for us, the common people. Now, the larger sutra tells us that there are beings from infinite past who work tirelessly to help us awaken. And we call them bodhisattvas. And a bodhisattva is one who makes sure that all other beings are awake as he is awakened. And they encourage us to switch channels from the ones that give us pleasure that's only good temporarily, to look for the Buddha channel. The Buddha channel takes us away from being distracted from the empty promises of an easy life. What it tells us is that there are disappointments, and there's anger, resentment. All these things are part of our lives. And yet what we see is that there is light. Shinran says in Shoshinge that the light of the sun illuminates and protects us always. And the clouds and mist of greed, anger, and hatred cover the sky of truth. But beneath the clouds and mist, there is brightness, not dark. And so he's saying that the sun is always shining, and that we must realize this. Because even though ignorance clouds our view and the future may seem dark, there is light. And when we say the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, we realize this. And so we can shift our perspective and look, as we do in our future, that there may be a week or so more of darkness, but there is light ahead. Now, we've been living in a very difficult year. But think about what happened 79 years ago this past week. The country of Japan attacked America at Pearl Harbor. And think of how people of our community, pioneers of this temple, felt as they viewed their December, the Mochitsuki. They may have been thinking even of Christmas and how they would spend New Year's. And less than 3 months later, things looked even darker because the executive order had gone out, 9066, where all Japanese Americans were taken from their homes and herded into concentration camps in remote parts of America. And after 3 years, they were released to go home with only a few dollars. Sangha members of this temple came back, and what they found was that this temple had been vandalized and set fire to. The upper hondo, our altar area, had been burned, and it was burned beyond repair. So what were they to do? They had to make a decision as to whether they could rebuild or what they would do in the future. It was a very dark time for them. People had no money. Few people had jobs. And they were wondering, could they make it? But because of the light they felt from the Nembutsu, they decided to rebuild. There was a situation in the Imperial Valley where the Japanese were not welcome. And so the temples at Brawley and El Centro had to close. And so this temple you see behind me is the altar or the onaijin from the El Centro temple. And so you see in that bleak time, they saw light, the light of the onaijin, the light of Amida. And so they brought that altar area to San Diego. The pioneers of this temple decided to work for the benefit of others, and that's us. The Bodhisattva works for our awakening, our benefit. They practice the 6 paramitas. especially patience, discipline, perseverance, wisdom. They practice dana, the first paramita, selfless giving, working for the benefit of others. In a week, Winter Solstice will be the darkest day, and then things will begin to lighten. In a month, we will have a new administration. I think truth, science, health, decency seem to be high on their agenda. There is a tone of coming together, and we as Buddhists have this sense of harmony. We know that ignorance, hatred, and greed can cause suffering, and we have been experiencing suffering. As Buddhists, we don't have to just sit by and meditate, but like the Buddha and Shakyamuni, the Buddha and Shinran, we can stand up to spread the Dharma of truth, interdependence. We also have peace, harmony, wisdom, and compassion. And these qualities just don't happen. As Buddhists, we must actively demonstrate these qualities and select our leaders so that we all can come together. So the Nembutsu reminds us that light surrounds us, and it's up to us to bring that light into action, to dispel the dark clouds of ignorance. We must be part of that light that brings joy, gratitude, wisdom, and compassion. So think of that as we go forward. We are in dark times. There are things that are very destructive toward us. We must think of helping each other by keeping the spread of this COVID-19 limited, and think, what can we do to light the way for others? Just as we realize that the efforts of others have contributed to our lives, we might think of what we might do for the cause of others. So please join me in expressing our deepest appreciation for all who have benefited us. We will do that with the recitation of the Nembutsu. Gasho, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namandas.